Because this is another example of how sometimes the dipshits figure things out that the scholars with their fancy PhDs can't.
You've been talking to the wrong people.
I'm sorry. I never know exactly which eye I'm supposed to look at. It's a little bit distracting.
Hi, and welcome to our Bible study channel.
Energy. Energy. You cannot fuck with this. Energy. You cannot fuck with this energy. Love to all those in this flesh. All of those who are listening. Don't miss the message, judging me. You cannot fuck with this energy. Energy.
These are videos that go pretty in depth. First thing you should probably do is pause and read our 12 rules for reading biblical text. And if you don't like the 12 rules or you don't understand the 12 rules, well, I don't have time to explain them all. Go back to the book that I wrote and uploaded on this channel, which takes you through the entire arc and how we made these quote-unquote 12 rules as a framework of what we found after 7 years digging meticulously and carefully through the text. So if you're confused, go do that. If I refer back, well, that's probably because we actually post these things in order. So they're all done in series. And if you jump in at the middle of a series without any schema or background knowledge, and you get all pissed off, well, that's also not our problem. This is a group where we go line by line, scroll by scroll through the text. Warning, we are not language sensitive, so if you can't handle some cussing, it's not the place for you. We also do not endorse nor approve of pretty much any mainstream theology. So if you're looking for that, also definitely not the place for you. We do a video about the characters that we use in our Bible study series. And the reason we do this is sort of so that they can kind of get in your head. So we do have a video explaining why we chose the people we chose and how their sort of energy characteristics go along with the biblical characters to modernize it for people so they know what the heck we're reading. Clearly, the Roman Church was not doing their job and looking for the lost sheep of the reunited House of David. So that's what we're doing, okay? We're taking that away from them because they screwed it up. The brilliant rabbis also down there in Babylon are also not looking for the lost sheep of the reunited kingdom of David. So you're not going to hear, let's follow Rome. And you're not going to hear, let's follow the rabbis on this channel. Because, you know, sorry, not sorry, but the Bible wasn't actually written for the corrupt Levitical priesthood post-Babylon and Persia to read it through their little janky books. And it also wasn't written to be read through the eyes of pagan 4th century church fathers. So we're not doing that either. You guys can both have a seat. Oddly enough, the Bible also wasn't written to be read through the eyes of some dumbass scholars with pieces of paper that say they're smarter than everyone, but have never seen a Davidic covenant in their life. Not written for them either. You know who it's written for? It's written for the reunited house of David, who are actually in covenant and are actually the sheep. That's who it's written for. That's why nobody else can understand what the heck's going on. What you are going to hear is what you're supposed to hear, which is, let's follow the king. and let's get started.
So, we are going to war.
Hello. Okay, here we go. We're gonna took the same question from the other day, right? About the JE, I always forget if it's PD or DP, hypothesis theory, the documentary hypothesis, and look at it now. Now that you have the worldview framework as to why I'm really low trust, and you have that personal opinion explanation, let's go and do a little scholarly breakdown here. Because this is another example of how sometimes the dipshits figure things out that the scholars with their fancy PhDs can't. Here it comes. Here it comes. Okay, and we're looking at this. I went to San Diego State, okay, and back in the day, late 80s, early 90s, San Diego State was like the party school. And it was basically a bunch of kids running around doing as much drugs as they could possibly shove in their system. And there's this little tiny strip of beach, little peninsula that we kind of took over. And it was our little infested area of debauchery. And we used to sit around, at 2, 3, 4 in the morning and talk about aliens and theorize, right? And everybody's stoned or blown out of their minds. And they just start rambling about their theories. Okay, that's what scholars think lay people do when they don't have a PhD from, Columbia or, Princeton. But they never seem to put that on themselves, okay? Just because you have a PhD. I'm down on the Alabama-Tennessee border right now. That's where I'm living, right on that border. And for a very long time, Alabama had the dipshit award for the lowest test scores. And the folks down here would say, well, we may have low test scores, but that means we also have low indoctrination levels. If we're not doing good by the government metrics of school, quote unquote, that just means we're less institutionalized. So how about that? And so kind of take that. And I want you to imagine these scholars, these brilliant scholars with their PhDs, sitting around, and they're all a bunch of nerds, and they finally got their chance, like Revenge of the Nerds, to sit down and smoke some weed and theorize. Okay, but their theories are not necessarily any more valid than our theories were. Sitting around a campfire at the beach doing shrooms. And I'm going to show you that a little bit today. And I know that's alarmist and arrogant of me to say, but back to the dumbass protocol, guys.
You've been talking to the wrong people.
I'm sorry. I never know exactly which eye I'm supposed to look at. It's a little bit distracting.
Luke 10, this wasn't given to the smart ones. It was given to the dipshits. And I am most definitely part of the dipshit conglomeration out here. And, so we're going to look at this. They're going to look at this. Not only are we going to look at the JEDP, but we're also going to look at Q. This whole Q thing. Oh, God, James Tabor loves his Q document. All right, selling books on that. We're selling books about a document that doesn't fucking exist, that they literally pulled out of their ass while smoking weed down at the Scholar Cafe. I don't know where this, well, we think that maybe this thing exists, but there's no evidence of it.
Shut up for once in your life. Shut your damn mouth.
That's like us sitting around at the beach talking about fucking Bigfoot, okay? But again, we have more evidence of Bigfoot than we do of these magical documents that don't exist. So I'm coming at this. You have to understand my day job, okay? What I do, well, I don't do this anymore for a living. I semi-retired out of that industry. But for a very long time, I worked in, I am a master degreed reading specialist, okay? And I got my master's degree back in the day when there was actually rigor in school and you actually had to study things to get a degree. And there is looking at it from a language acquisition framework, okay? We're going to do a little reading specialist stuff here today. Behind both the JEDP and the Q document, this mysterious Q document that doesn't really exist, there is a linguistic presumption that is baked into this JEPD theory, and we're going to start there. And I think it is long overdue for questioning. So I would love to sit down with my piddly-ass master's degree, smoking pot at the beach, taking my LSD hits, and talk to these scholars and question them on this. But no one has, because, well, they don't respect reading specialists. They don't respect anybody without a PhD. So how dare we have information that might look at it differently? You see what I'm saying? It's this arrogance they have. But this assumption that needs to be questioned is that there was, to begin with, that there exists magically in the world of history some standardized, written, quote unquote, Hebrew language. Okay? Back in the day, Hebrew wasn't a language. Hebrew is a language now. Okay? And what they're doing is they're retrofitting that word. This is so important to understand. People are starting to understand that just because you name a country Israel doesn't mean that it in any way remotely reflects the actual people from historical biblical times that were the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Ephraim, Israel. Those two things don't match. They're not the same people. And we've taken the name of a people group and a kingdom, and we've rebranded that name, Israel, and slapped it on a Rothschild country. And so because it's the same word, it means the same thing, okay? This is what I call the Amelia Bedelia protocol.
We own that door. You try to stop us, and we will knock it down.
Now, if you don't know who Amelia Bedelia is a set of books, okay? And I hate Amelia Bedelia books. For a while, I don't know, in the 90s maybe, all the teachers were running around with Amelia Bedelia books, and me, the one with the master's in reading, is running and going, hey guys, don't use that, okay? Let's not use Amelia Bedelia, because she butchers syntax and grammar, and it's funny to read at home, like, as a bedtime story with your kids. But it's not fun to put them out for like independent reading time when the children don't have a guide to understand what they're reading. Because what Amelia Bedelia does is what I argue this dude, Amon Hillman, that guy, right, who he's got really popular with his little demon theory. What they're doing is they're seeing things. Let me put it this way. If you're a hammer, everything becomes a nail. That's Amelia Bedelia. So she'll say something like, I'm trying to even think. She'll take multiple meaning words. Okay. So she'll say, cake. Okay. Take the word cake. And there's a physical, literal cake, like a birthday cake. But you can also use cake as a verb. Like that lady caked on her makeup, slathered it on there in really thick layers. And so the layer cake is like turns into a verb. Two different meanings though. So then Amelia Bedelia is showing how funny multiple meaning words are if you don't understand that there's two different contexts. So they'll say, they'll use the word caked, and Amelia Bedelia, the dumbass maid, will come out with like cake all over her face. You get what I'm saying? So it's a funny book on multiple meanings. So I said that to say this. The scholars are playing Amelia Bedelia with the word Hebrew. They're assuming that Hebrew is not a people group. 2,000 years ago, 2,900 years ago, when David was walking around, or 3,000 years ago, we've got King David. They assume he spoke Hebrew. He didn't speak Hebrew. He was a Hebrew, and there's a very big difference. You can't take the name of a modern language, which is Hebrew, and retroactively fit it back to 3,000 years ago and say there was a Hebrew language back then, just because we call the Masoretic stuff Hebrew today. You can't say that the Rothschild Israel is Israel back then, just because you're calling it Israel today. That's the sleight of hand that I'm talking about here. So now there's a Hebrew language. When David was walking around, there were Hebrew people. There is no evidence that there was a written Hebrew language. Does that make sense? That's what I'm saying. So if there's no Hebrew language 3,000 years ago, okay, it's certainly not complete with a divine name, quote unquote, Yahweh or Yahoo or Yahwoo or Yeehaw or anything else. Like, we don't know what it was because there were no vowels. Okay. None of this written language existed with vowels in the 1900s BC. Okay. So this theory that there's this magical language that developed, it's not only academically sleight of hand nefarious to take a modern language name of Hebrew and retroactively fit it 3,000 years ago to a people group and then say, well, it wasn't really people, it was really a language. Like, you can't do that.
You're digging in the ditch, baby, with this.
It's so dishonest. And it's got fairy dust all over them. And they're doing it to justify the modern state called Israel. That's what they're doing. They're giving validity to the Masoretic rabbinical tradition by saying, yeah, it's just, they had that language back then. They didn't. They made it up. It's not real. Okay, there's no evidence. That's why we call it the Bigfoot scrolls. So there's this assumption. Now, and people go, well, yeah, you're just anti-Semitic. No, I'm a reading specialist. So we're going to look at it in that way today to show you why I'm so mocking of this piece, okay? We're going to break down this theory with this lens, and why this lens has to lean on the idea that this Hebrew group of people have their own language called Hebrew, and it's the same as the Masoretic text with those. That whole link, what they're doing is they're teaching that, think of the theory of evolution, okay? Everyone's back in the theory of evolution. I'm still sitting here 50 fucking years later. Nobody's shown me the missing link. Remember the famous missing link that links humans to monkey people? There's still no link. You've put really pretty mannequins of monkey people into museums that you've quote unquote recreated based on your theory, but there's no missing link scientific. It doesn't exist. It's not there. But yet you're told this theory as truth, even though the missing link somehow got lost. They're doing the same thing with text. And I can catch them just because of my background in reading sciences. I understand how neurologically the brain works and how people have language and reading acquisition, because it was my job to go in and teach kids with Down syndrome or dyslexia or whatever they had, or years behind in reading, no phonics, no phonemic awareness, I had to restructure their brains and teach them how to read. That's what I do. So we're going to break down why this theory leans so hard on the idea that there's this magical ancient Hebrew text language thing, and there's no evidence for it. So JEPD, when you're looking at language acquisition from this reading lens, reading specialist lens, there's a clear order. And again, these overlap, okay? These overlap as you grow and develop. But basically, rule of thumb, you've got to hear something before you're able to say it. I cannot say an Arabic word that I've never heard. It's just not going to pop in my brain magically. You've got to hear it first, and then you start to say it. Welcome to little toddlers running around learning to speak, right? They're imitating what they hear. This is why ESL kids, English as a second language, kids when you're acquiring a second language, this is why kids are able to acquire second languages more than adults, because they're hearing it in the home constantly. It's that hearing piece. That's phonology. That's phonological, is the hearing of the sounds. Phonological has nothing to do with anything written down on paper, on tablet, on stone, and papyrus, nothing. Nothing to do with writing. It's all about hearing, okay? So a lot of times when someone comes up to me and they come to me to help their kids or their grandkids read, the very first thing I would do as a reading specialist is ask them for their medical history. And I would say, are there any ear infections? Did you ever have tubes in your ear as a baby? Chronic ear infections. Those types of things impact their reading. Why? Because they weren't able to properly hear the sounds when they were babies or toddlers or preschool or whatever. So if you don't have a strong phonological or hearing basis for the sounds, it's going to be much harder to be able to assign those individual sounds to letters on a paper and unlock that code once we go from hearing and speaking to coding it onto paper. Make sense? Makes sense. So you got to hear it, then you say it, then you can read it, then you can write it. Think about some of the names in the Bible. Like I'll come across a name of some dude in the Bible and I can't read it, right? Because I've never heard it. So I'm seeing the word. I can use context clues to figure out like the king of hoo-ha, right? But I don't know how to pronounce that word because I've never seen it before. I've never heard someone pronounce it before. So I'm using the best I can with my phonics to sort of mispronounce the word the best I can. Make sense? So you go hearing, saying. Once you can hear it and say it, now you can recognize the word in print. Make sense? And if you don't hear people saying the word with hearing and speech, and you come across a word that you've just never heard before, even if it's in English in the Bible, you still don't know how to read it because you've never heard someone say it before. So that's where you go to decoding and you use your phonics skills. And they're like, it's not Ephraim, it's Ephraim. Or it's not Ephraim, it's Ephraim or Ephraim. Like there's 15 fucking ways to say it. I've never, like, what's the right way? I don't know. I don't know. Ephraim, 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 Ephraim. Who the fuck knows, right? You're just using your phonetic background to say the word. Does that make sense? You can still kind of read it. You know what it means, but you've got to hear it, say it, read it. It all goes together. Then once you have a lexicon of vocabulary that you have command of, okay, you've got an encyclopedia in your brain, a dictionary, if you will, of all these words that you've heard and say, and you use them in your speech now, and those develop over time. Little babies aren't, 3-year-olds aren't talking about quantum physics because they don't have the vocabulary. Does that make sense? They're not walking around saying, oh, that was a quantum thing. They haven't heard the word yet. Once they start to hear the word, that word comes into their vocabulary. And the more they hear it, the more they use it. Does that make sense? So this is vocabulary building. Then once you have a giant lexicon of words that you can hear, say, and read, well, now your writing is better because you've got this expansive vocabulary that you have command of. You have a larger lexicon to draw from to put into your writing. So generally, it just goes in that order. And of course, these are constantly developing in sort of that spiral, right? This is why kids gain more vocabulary as they grow, because they're hearing more words, they're taking in more complex topics, so they have more to say. Make sense? Makes sense. Where when they're starting out, it's like mom, dad, milk, like base juice. They're saying basic words. And then the more they hear it, the more they get it, they start to say more. And then it goes all the way through. Okay. So starting with that, there's overlaps. But that's the context of language acquisition. But that's the context within a modern, stable, written language called English or frickin' Spanish that's already established. Does that make sense? We already have a written, established language with certain rules and certain graphemes written down that are coded letters, aka that go with the sounds that we hear. That code has already been in place for many, many years. So we're working within a fixed system that's already established. You can't read or write anything without a complex system of both phonological, which is hearing the sounds, right, and phonetic language, meaning now phonological is what you hear. I can do a full reading lesson with kids without ever having anything on paper. And we just play sound games, like rhyming. Like if I say to you, act, pick out the middle sound. Ah, there you go. That's a phonological awareness. I'm testing. Can the kid hear the different sounds in cat? What's the end sound in cat? What's the beginning sound in cat? I can do this all day long with kids to see if they can differentiate between the sounds. Then I can make it a whole sentence. The cat ran around the tree. How many words in that sentence? And the kid has to count. The cat ran around the tree. Okay, that's 6 words. Sometimes they get 7 because they're counting syllables. Go down to Mexico, and I always tell people, because I lived in Mexico for quite a long time, and I always tell people, shh, slow down, because my hearing can't differentiate between your words because they're fluent speakers. So when they speak, all the words kind of roll together. They are not speaking like this to give my brain long enough to process each word. They're shoving them all together and I'm getting confused, right? That's all phonological. It's a hearing-based neurological system in your brain. But you can't have a written, you can't read or write unless you have both that I just explained, which is phonological, and phonetics. Well, what is phonetics? That's hooked on phonics. That's the shape of the letter G says G and J. The shape of the letter R says R. The letter I says I and I. The letter, P says P. The letter E says A and E. And sometimes right? All of these codes where you look at a letter, T, and T is t, t, t. That's phonics. It's the sound plus the code on the paper. That's decoding. SH together, what is that symbol? SH together, what does that symbol say? Shh. Make sense? If you don't know you might be able to say dish, wish, and fish all day long. But that doesn't mean you can look at a piece of paper and FISH, you know what it says. You've got to code the sh sounds with the F-I-S-H together. There's this coding that takes place in the brain between what you can hear and say, and then identifying those sounds on paper, which is phonics. So they're two completely different systems in your brain. That's the first thing, okay? So I argue they didn't have a phonetic language, a phonetic. I hooked on phonics. They didn't have hooked on phonics 3,000 years ago. They only had phonological awareness, which is the hearing and speaking. They didn't decode those sounds into a set of letters or symbols that stand for each sound. That wasn't complete. It wasn't standardized. Therefore, they can't read. Therefore, they can't write. Make sense? So they're right, this magical ancient Hebrew language, not a people, it's a language now, that just so happens to match the Masoretic text that they invented 3,000 fucking years later. Their writing system, these scrolls that you're finding, the steles with the inscriptions on the archaeological finds, right? That says, House of David, right? That writing carved into a rock or carved or like written on a papyrus paper, that was Phoenician, okay? In Phoenician, think hieroglyphics, all right? It was hieroglyphic language, which is conceptual and hearing based, not phonics decoding based. Make sense? So if I put, a picture of a sun on a flashcard for a kindergartner, the kindergartner is going to say sun. But does the picture of the sun actually say the words S-U-N? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Does that make sense? If I show that same picture to a student who speaks a different dialect or a different language, they're still going to know the concept. But they might say soul instead of sun, right? Because they don't have that coded into consonants and vowels. It's not a phonics language. Make sense? If I held up a picture, of John the Baptist, right? And I show it to a first grader sitting in Oklahoma, they're going to say John. I show the same picture to a first grader sitting in Mazatlan, they're going to go Juan, because there's no coded language with the picture. It's just a symbol for a concept that's triggered in the phonology part of the brain, not the written phonics part. I hope I'm making sense here. Okay? So ancient, quote unquote, magical Hebrew wasn't a language. It was just symbolic Phoenician. That's what I'm saying. So literacy development requires a stable, standardized, written system to capture the sounds, the phonological part, with the phonics rules. So this is the progression. It assumes a phonologically stable language is already in place. And there's a phonics compatible orthography or system of putting those two things together. Without a standardized system of grapheme and phoneme correspondence, grapheme is writing, graph, write, pencil, graph, grapheme. If there's no writing that matches every single sound, you do not have a full system of reading and writing. True, quote unquote, reading and writing, which means language acquisition in literacy, cannot occur. It cannot happen. You can have speaking and hearing, but you don't have literacy. Make sense? This is why Americans are illiterate, because the kids can say things and hear things, but they can't fucking read shit. They don't have the sounds that they hear and say. They can't code those onto letters on the page. They're not understanding that part. So symbolic recognition is different than oral memorization. Okay? So this symbolic recognition of sun or wan, that can take the place of, memorization, but it's not constituting literacy in the modern sense. Does that make sense? So that's the first thing, is they're automatically assuming that this magic full language existed 3,000 years ago, and there's zero evidence of that. So to say the Yahwist source came first, well, there was no writing. Like there was writing like scribble scratch, graffiti, but there was no ancient cohesive system of phonics back then. It was just hieroglyphic concepts. That's what I'm saying. So Phoenician script was hearing based, phonology based, not phonics decoding based. So this whole Phoenician writing system 3,000 years ago was consonant based. They just had consonants. So now I want you to think of the letter card where I hold up the card to the first grader and it shows a picture of a sun. And then I put the letter S. That's all. I don't put the U. It just. And the kid says, oh, sun. Very good. And then I show it to someone in Mexico and they say, soul. Two different fucking words. Same concept. Even the same beginning sound encoded with the S. Two totally different cultures, languages, background, belief systems. And they're just pretending that every single person who lived back there 3,000 years ago was using the Masoretic way that they interpreted 3 years ago, like yesterday. They made it up yesterday, but trust us. That's what they're doing.
Make every song you sing a better tune. Make the love shine a light on you. Wow, like an evening sun.
Is they're saying there was this language. The rabbi said so. Like, really? Ancient language 3,000 years ago was built on phonological awareness, the recognition of sound patterns and concepts, not phonics, which requires explicit grapheme phoneme mapping. You've got to map every oral sound to a cue on the page. So their quote unquote decoding had nothing to do with text. It was conceptual, contextual, independent on prior knowledge, not systematic, mathematical sound letter correspondence. That wasn't what it was. These were flashcards, not essays. Make sense? So ancient reading, quote unquote, was symbolic. They were mnemonic devices for memory. Okay? They were graffiti. It wasn't decoding and literacy and language as we think of it today. So if you don't have vowels and you don't have standardized phonics rules that are putting the sounds to the script on the page, ancient reading was more like symbol cueing. So they put up the stele and everyone knows that means House of David. Just like I can hold up a card in a kindergarten class and everybody knows it's the sun. But they're not reading anything. How many times have you sat down with your own children and you're reading their favorite bedtime story over and over and over and over and over? And they're like, I want to hear, fucking Pinocchio again. And sure as shit, they know they can, quote unquote, read that book. My kids have come to me 100 times and said, look, I'm reading. You're not fucking reading. What you're doing is you're finding the pattern in the book and you're looking at the pictures, which is fine. It's age appropriate and it's lovely, but they're not technically decoding shit. Okay. When I go to my little ones and the book will say, open up these really early readers, right? And they say, the ball is red. The ball is green. The ball is yellow. the ball is blue. The end, right? It doesn't take kids who have an understanding of language and hearing and sound, and they've now built a vocabulary with hearing and speaking. It doesn't take them very long to figure out the pattern of that book, right? They're not reading the word the. They just know it's the ball is. And then they look at the page, and whatever color ball is on the page, there's a big picture next to it that happens to have the color red on it. And so they go, oh, the ball is, and they recognize red, and they say red. Then they turn the page, and there's a big blue ball, and they know the pattern. The ball is, oh, blue. And then they feel good. They feel confident. They're playing with language. They're learning their colors, and they feel like they're reading. But they're not decoding shit. Okay, they're not going T-H-E, z, z, that's the, yeah, that's not E, that's not long E, that's not short E. Yeah, that's, okay, the, b, oh, they're not doing that, right? Oh, that's not an ah, because there's two L's after it. And the phonics system tells me that when A is followed by two A's, it has an aw sound, so it's ball. Like, they're not doing that process, right? They're not even saying B from ball and going buh. They're just memorizing. It's a memorization technique. They're memorizing the language, they're memorizing the pattern, and they see the picture and they go with it. Welcome to ancient Phoenician, okay? It was symbolic cueing, all right? Or ritual interpretation, if you will. So you need to already know the context to interpret the symbols correctly. This is fundamentally different from modern reading, which lies on this decoding pattern. And when you see an unfamiliar word, like Ephraim, at least you know that that word, E-P-H-R-A-I-M, it follows certain rules. So it's short E-eh, P-H says F, so we're at F. And then Raim, R-A-I is A like rain, Ray, A-I, so we're going to say Ephraim. Could be Ephraim, but probably Ephraim. We don't know, right? But you're using a system that's already in place to decode the word. Does that make sense? They didn't have that system. So if they don't have a standard system in place, they can't fucking read. And if they can't fucking read, well, they can't fucking write. That's what I'm saying. It's very simple. Very simple, scholars. Very simple, scholars. Very simple, scholars. So what they're doing is they're assuming that there is this language that everybody agreed on with all of these coded sounds to letters, and that's simply not the case. Does that make sense? So early writing systems like Phoenician served as conceptual scaffolds for encoding meaning. So if I'm worshiping the sun god, instead of putting it on a flashcard for my kindergartners, I'm going to go and I'm going to carve it into a rock. And they're going to, oh, sun god, we got it. So these systems were designed for trade, for ritual, for record keeping. They were not there for developing literacy as we think of it today. They didn't have any of the structural language mapping features that are completely necessary for a rule-based, standardized, phonics-based reading and writing system, like graphing phoneme alignment. They didn't have it, okay? So they relied heavily on oral tradition and symbolic representation. They did not support any kind of phonics-based decoding, okay? So early quote-unquote reading and writing, they weren't literacy practices in the contemporary sense. They were just ritual, symbolic things embedded within their cultural and dimensional framework. That's what it was. So now that you know that, now that you understand how language acquisition works, we got to return to our JEPD and Q series. So what the JEPD hypothesis completely stands upon is it assumes that this magical Hebrew Phoenician phonics writing system existed. And it had the word Yahweh in it, and it had it in 950 BC. That they had all of this language structured phonetic system. They didn't. It was phonological. So although we have evidence that shows fragmentary inscriptions, evolving scripts, and regional blends of deities, we don't have a cohesive phonics-based written and language, meaning there wasn't literacy. Literacy, as we think of it today, did not exist in 950 BC. It's a whole nother system. So this theory, how they built this JEDP theory, is they looked at literary style, not forensic registry. This is the difference. It drives me bananas. When I would work in education, people didn't understand the difference between an English teacher and a reading specialist, because that all has to do with books. No. English teachers are fluffy. Those are the guys that sit around and teach Shakespeare. Okay? Those are the ones who are like, oh, let's open a book and everybody sit in the corner and draw a picture. That's those guys, right? They love the poetry and all those things and the genres of reading and the novel studies. That's English. I do phonics-based, comprehension-based, fluency-based interventions, which is completely different world than let's sit around and read Shakespeare. So if you can see the difference, JEDP is a theory built on the English teachers of scholars. So what they did was they looked at the literary style of these different subcategories or factions of writers. So anytime that something was encoded with this YH, they just shoved it into one group. These guys all sound the same, so we're going to put them in a group. That's all they did. Or like the language of this kind of fits with the language of that, so we're going to put it in a group. So these are all your Shakespeare people, or like these are all your sonnets, and these are all, your Emily Bronte people. That's what they're doing. This is Mark Twain over here, and this is Shakespeare over here. That's all they're doing, is they're separating it by the literary style, not forensic evidence of language acquisition. So it has to assume that this magical Hebrew systematic language of phonics, not phonological, phonics, exists. They have to assume that. So the Yahwist uses Yahweh, and it was supposedly written in 950. The Elohist uses Elohim in 850. The Deuteronomists were very law-heavy around 600, and the priestly source came in the 500s, which is post-Babylon. But to tell me that there is a Yahwist source that is the oldest, and they had a written full system of written language in 900 BC, bullshit. No, they didn't. They didn't. It was Phoenician. That's all it was. So you can take all of this up to like the Deuteronomist, maybe halfway through that, maybe later, into the priestly. There was no written text until well into the priestly source, where they started writing things down. So nobody in the Yahwist century had a cohesive, encoded, literacy to today's standards language. They didn't have it. They were still doing hieroglyphics. So now you've got the priestly sources coming back and writing shit down with the... So you see what I'm getting? So yes, I do believe that there were different groups of people. And I believe there was a group of people that believed in this Yahweh character. And I believe there was a group of people who believed in, Elohists, the Elohim people. And I believe that there were, Deuteronomy, law-heavy people. And then there were priestly people who were ritual-focused. But why the hell Deuteronomy and priestly? You're telling me that the priestly people weren't law-heavy? The priests were the people who made the laws. So why is there a difference between Deuteronomy and priestly? There shouldn't be. They're the same fucking people. The elites and the priesthood from the kingdom of Judah, not bloodline, kingdom, were taken to Babylon. Persia sent them back. This is the key. And when Persia sent back the elites, the politicians and priesthood, they told them, you can't have a king. We're the kings. You have to control the people. Well, let's look at Persia. Persia controlled their people from a very administrative society. They believed in laws, rules, and regulations. Every fucking thing you did in Persia had to follow the law. Well, suddenly, we've got the Levite priesthood coming in, writing all these laws. Well, if you are literal Judah, like from the tribe of Judah, and you are the peasantry in the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribes of Simeon, and some Edomites thrown in, and some Philistines thrown in, and some Egyptians thrown in, and you're just regular commoners living in the kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah. And all these priests and politicians come back, and they're like, hey guys, you have to follow all these laws now because Persia said so. The people aren't going to fucking listen. Imagine them coming in today. Hey guys, Trump and all of his people in Congress and all the politicians and your fucking billionaires, Mark Zuckerberg gets up on stage, Bill Gates, they all stand up in a big meeting. All your priesthood and politicians, and the Pope, they bring the Pope in, and they all stand in this big news brief today. And they say, hey guys, yeah, you have to follow all these laws now because China said so. The fuck you think the American people are going to do? Like, screw off, dudes. No. But if they come back, now I want you to imagine the same thing. These priests and politicians come back into the southern kingdom and say, okay, guys, you have to follow these laws because Persia said so? No. How about you have to follow all these laws because Moses said so? We found this document and it's got all these magical laws in it. And you have to do it because Moses said so. Now we're in a whole nother ball game. And not only did Moses say so, but God told Moses. So these are all the laws. And here's 17,000 laws that everybody has to follow now. Fast forward 500 years, Jesus comes back and goes, fuck you, house of David, your laws suck. People don't realize that that's what Jesus did. They still have in their brain that Jesus came, claimed Davidic lineage, and then said, but I'm still following the Jewish Pharisee law because I'm Jewish. That's a modern overlay. Jesus did not follow the Pharisee law, period. He followed the original Sinai law, not the Babylonian priesthood law that came back from Persia. So all that rabbinical shit, throw it out. That's Jesus threw it out. Okay. He said, you try to convert people. You're forcing them to do your laws. You've got all these laws, but they do not capture the law of God. Like, what the fuck are you doing? These are laws of man. Like, he repeats himself 75 times. Here's what Jesus said in modern language. Your fucking laws suck. We ain't doing those. Sorry. Now, did they base their priestly laws on Moses? Yes, they did. But they went bananas with it. They went fucking off the kilter bananas to control the people. Jesus didn't convert anybody to Judaism. Okay? He said, you convert people to your religion and you make them twice as son as hell as you are. Well, why are they a son of hell? Oh, because they're Jews. That's anti-Semitic. Forget Jew. Forget the fucking modern people Jew. Forget it. They're not the same people. They were post-Babylon priesthood. It's like me going to Rome and saying, fuck off with your laws. Your laws are stupid. That's what Jesus did. I don't need to fucking talk in a booth. Let it go. That's what Jesus was doing. But instead of doing it to the Roman Catholic Church, he was doing it to these Yahwists, basically, and the priesthood. So there's different groups of people, but I don't like to break them down the way that this theory does. So that's the first thing. So yes, I think there were people who were Yahwists, and yes, I think there were Elohists, and yes, there were Deuteronomists, and yes, there were priestly people. But I don't think that there was a language in 950 BC that was a set standardized language. We'd have zero evidence of that. So if you take away their ancient Hebrew language, which they don't call ancient Hebrew system of phonics, they'll never say that. They just say the ancient Hebrew Bible. That's a sleight of hand. Are you talking about ancient Hebrew written system of graphemes Bible? That's what people assume. Or are you talking about the ancient Bible, quote unquote, of the Hebrew people? The oral stories, the traditions, the culture, the shit passed down, right? The pierogi fucking recipe of my grandmother. That's a handed down thing where you just know things and you pass it down. That's the ancient Hebrew Bible. This culture, this oral tradition, this frequency, this way of following God, these stories that are passed down. That's the Bible. There was no written language to write that down.
It's God's side and the other side. And we don't care nothing about the other side. Period. Period. All of these big dick deviants is all catching hell in 2024. It's up for all of them. All lies will be exposed. That's all. And anyone who takes that the wrong way, know why they take it the wrong way. The truth is the light.
In 950. Does that make sense? So, you know, a lot of people say, well, David must have been Yahwist. Because every time a word's coming out of David's mouth, he's talking about Yahweh. Really? Really? You're assuming that, you know, in 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago, that what David was saying fits in to a systematic literacy system that didn't exist. So was David saying Yahweh? Was David saying Yahoo? Was David saying Yoo-hoo? Was David saying hee-haw? Like, we don't know what the fuck David was saying because they didn't have a language to write down. The sounds coming out of David's mouth did not have a code for each of the sounds on paper. David could have been saying, you know, water bottle for all we know. Like, we don't know what the phonological was because we don't know what the code was. It was a symbol of this, which is why the name gets dangerous. Because they're like, well, these letters are a symbol for God. Yes. And it means I am. Okay. So they're running around going, the I am dude, the big dude, the presence guy. Why isn't his name Presence? You know, maybe David was like, oh, my divine presence. Like, we don't know the sounds coming out of his mouth and how they matched. That's what I'm trying to explain. And people don't get it because they don't understand the difference between phonological and phonics. David didn't have phonics. There was no hooked on phonics in David's time. So there was no way to decode what he was saying onto paper with sound letter correspondence. That's an assumption. That's an assumption until much, much later. Now, if they come up with a scroll one day that shows that this systematic language acquisition of writing existed, I'll change my theory. But until then, we don't have any fucking idea what these people called their gods. We don't know. We don't know what their names were. And then if we did, because of oral tradition, well, your priests, your rabbis, your Yahwists, and your Elohists all came in and did janky shit to the scrolls. And they're like, I'm going to write it my way. No, I'm going to write it my way. No, I'm going to write it my way. That's what I'm saying. So I don't think that they go in order like this. I don't think they go in order like this. It's impossible for them to go in order like this. Now, if you erase the dates, okay, and you just have a Yahwist group, an Elohist group, a Deuteronomist group, and a priestly group, and mix them all together around 6, 5, 6, 7, or excuse me, I'm going the wrong way. 5, 4, 300 years BC, and they all got their hands in the soup. Now that's a better theory. Now it's a better theory. But you can't date this language to then because it didn't exist. This whole theory and all of their dating and all of their grouping assumes that these different sources were written, not oral. It assumes that the use of Yahweh in this J source reflects a linguistically stable, literate, grapheme-coded culture all the way back in 10th century BC, 3,000 years ago. It wasn't there. There's no archaeological evidence that quote-unquote Hebrew writing, especially with the Tetragrammaton, was remotely standardized in a system or widespread that far back. So now I look at the Yahwist and I go, well, that's interesting. Because the Yahweh sources do seem to match with Jesus. Like Genesis 2, I think, is Yahwist. And I tend to go with Genesis 2 way more than Genesis 1. So, like, who are these people? You know, and why are we calling them this, not that? But are we sure that they didn't just go in and plug in Yahweh because that's the God they wanted David to be talking about? David was talking about God. But we don't know what David was calling God. Somebody came along and decided, we're going to attach David and the words that came out of his mouth to Yahweh. They decided that later. We don't know that that's what David said because there's no written language at the time. We don't know what David said. Does that make sense? So to see a different perspective on this, I put some videos in here. Searching for the early, and again, I don't recommend anything for theology. I just recommend it for nuggets of information to kind of go back and forth and debate while you're bringing together your own ideas and thinking about these things. Because searching for the earliest mention of the Israelites' God, this looks at inscriptions, which mention this code, but they date it to the 9th century or later. They're fragmentary, they're regional, and they're mixed with other gods. Okay? How we got the Bible, part 2, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts. This goes into the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nash Papyrus, which are much, much, much later. And what they're showing is that this grapheme script, this writing, right, going from sound to writing and coding, if you will, coding on paper, is evolving. So they're learning to make, like, it's the language in writing is evolving over time. It's not just a fixed system as we think of like English today. You can't take a very systematic language like English with the coding of hearing and writing and apply what we've developed in modern times and apply it back to 3,000 years ago. They didn't have it yet. It wasn't developed to the point yet to even have a Yahweh source 1000 BC. That's what they're not understanding. So you've got a bunch of dudes in English class, a bunch of English teachers, right, sitting there calling themselves textual critics, smoking weed, going, dude, what if there was this language, man? Because like all these guys have this certain picture of a sun on it. And so like we're going to call them the soul group. And anything that has a picture of the sun, we're going to put them in a group and we're going to label that 900s. Like that's what they're doing. And we're going to call that a language. But that's you can't do that, right? They can't do that. Can't do that. And then there's Jaco Garicki, I don't know, whatever, PhD. And he looks into this philosophical ambiguity of Yahweh as a name, showing how it may have emerged from Canaanite or Edomite traditions, not a pristine Hebrew language coded registry. These are ideas. These are concepts captured in graffiti. They're not a grapheme, orthological, phonological to phonics system. They didn't have that set mathematical system yet. So what JEPD does, although it gives a good idea of there's these people involved and these people involved, these people involved, when you get to dating and all these people are Yahwehs and all the, like that handy little grouping of putting people in boxes, that's not going to hold weight under linguistic systems, archaeology, anything else. It's just a convenient way for them to say, well, David must have believed in Yahweh, so everybody has to say Yahweh now. Like that's what they're doing, but it doesn't hold weight. What I think is more valuable with the JEDP is to think, okay, wait, you have to remember, 20 years ago, okay, 20 years ago, if you walked up to the average Christian and said, the first 5 books of the Bible was actually not written by Moses, they would have burned you alive. Like, you're fucking crazy. Moses literally walked out of the desert holding all the scrolls in his hand, literally. Like, Moses himself wrote the Bible. That's where we were a few years ago, okay? That's where some people still are. I've gone in and listened in on like live streams and seen comments. No, I don't believe in JEDP because Moses wrote the Bible. There wasn't writing. Then Moses must have lived like 50 years ago, because back in the day, they didn't have writing to that extent for Moses to write those kind of detailed laws. Like that didn't exist. So I don't know when you must think that Moses must have lived like, 100 years before Jesus, because the language wasn't developed for Moses to write the Bible. So I think it's good in starting to get Christians' brains to the point where there are different people who contributed to the making up of the scrolls of the Bible. Lots of different groups wrote these scrolls. Lots of different groups edited those scrolls. Lots of different groups were in charge of taking the handed down oral traditions and like, let's fix this. Imagine if the whole time, just imagine this. Imagine, I'm not saying this happened, I'm just giving you an example. Imagine David's out there, and every time he goes prone and falls to the ground and prays, he's praying to El. Imagine that. And he's like, oh, El, I love you. El, show me your ways. El, 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 El. And the Yahwist comes in and goes, we don't really want David to be saying El, because that sort of fits more with the northern people. And we just connect to David and Judah. So we're going to just erase all the L's, and we're going to put in Yahweh. And imagine they did that in 650 BC. How the fuck would anybody know? You don't. Because David didn't write anything down, because David was illiterate. Sorry, David was illiterate. And I don't mean stupid. I mean, there was no system developed for him to use to write what he was saying coded into language. It just wasn't there. So this idea that YHWH was written in magical Hebrew script 3,000 years ago, this is a literary reconstruction by a bunch of pot-smoking English teachers. It's not a forensic, archaeological, or even logical basis, because they didn't have it. Unless you want to tell me that it's so magical that God, God put magic sparkle dust on these people, so only they knew how to write. But everybody else throughout all history didn't know how to write, except the people who wrote the Bible. Those are the only people who know how to write. But those scrolls somehow got lost. We haven't found those yet, but we know they're there. We know that David wrote this down. So we know exactly what David said when he was praying to God. We know exactly what it sounds like. We know exactly what words he used, because David had a phonological system of writing. They can't say that. It didn't happen. If it pops up, I'll change my mind. But like David's crest, right? Think of like, the family crest. Just because you see a family crest inscribed in a rock in fucking Saudi Arabia doesn't mean all of a sudden David has a language that's written down with phonemic and phonic mathematical correspondence. It means they inscribed David's family crest on a rock. Am I making sense? I hope I'm making sense. So what JEDP actually does, and they sound really good because they're scholars, they have PhDs, and everyone's like, ooh, but they're looking on style differences. And they're looking on how they pronounce the name of God, the different divine name usage to separate the sources. So let's just say I'm sitting down at a cafe having coffee with my friend, and I say, I am going to pray to God about this. And my friend sitting next to me having coffee, who's also in the Davidic covenant, okay, says, yes, I was talking to the Lord last night, And then a third person says, oh, Yeshua's father. Okay. And the fourth person says, oh, there were these janky Elohim around, but I'm in the Davidic covenant. So I just, the Most High El came along and kicked them all out. We're four people talking about the same God, if we're all in Davidic covenant, okay? And we're using different names for the same fucking people because we're talking within the umbrella of covenant. Now imagine, and we're all in the same time period, right? We're not thousands of years apart. We're not theologically different, but we're still using different names. Now imagine that I'm sitting at the coffee shop and I say, I'm in the Davidic covenant, and I say, well, I'm going to go home. I got to pray to Jesus's father about this. And then someone else who is Christian and under Pauline Trinitarian covenant says, well, yeah, I'm going to talk to Yahweh. No, I'm going to talk to Lord Christ. I'm going to talk to Christ. There you go. There's one. So I'm going to talk to Jesus' father. The next person who's a Pauline Christian says, well, I'm going to go home and I'm going to pray to Christ, the Logos entity. And then another Hebrew roots person sits down and goes, well, me and Yeshua were having a conversation. I don't even know what Yeshua you're talking about. You talking about Yeshua from the contract of David, or you talking about Yeshua, the light in the desert? Two different Yeshuas. So just because we're using certain names doesn't mean any of us are in the same covenant. He could be following the rabbis, and he's in the rabbi covenant. I don't fucking know what covenant they're in just because you use a name. And so now the scholars come along 3,000 years later, and they say, well, the guy that said Yeshua at the table at the coffee shop, and he wrote something down to Yeshua, he goes in the 1st century, because that's what they called Jesus in the 1st century. And then the lady that said Christ, well, we're going to put her with Rome. We're going to move her and all her writing. We're going to go and put her in the 4th century, because that's when this Christ entity came along. And then the crazy lady talking about the Davidic covenant, we don't even know what the fuck that is. So we're going to throw her all the way back with this random, Jesus's father thing. Like, we don't even know what that means. So, yeah, we're going to put her, I don't know, we'll throw her in with the Ebian or something. Like, that's what they were doing to come up with the JEDP theory. And it's ridiculous. So they're looking on these stylistic differences in speech patterns in divine name uses to separate these sources and slap a date on them. But if Yahweh, quote unquote, wasn't a stable written term in 950 BC, because they didn't have stable writing, then the entire dating system they've constructed this on collapses. Make sense? Until you can show me that ancient Hebrew language even exists, we don't have a theory. What we do have is the idea that different groups of people came together to put their fingerprints on the text, but maybe not in the categories they've placed them. So hopefully you can take a screenshot and look at some of those. And why this matters. Well, then we have the Q source. Oh God, the Q source drives me bananas. This is where scholars happen to notice that Matthew and Luke share stories that are not in Mark. So they're like, well, there's this lost document. And both Matthew and Mark use this lost document to craft their story. They had to get they couldn't have gotten the information on their own. They had to copy off of someone's paper. And since it's not Mark, well, there has to be this magical missing document that has all the sayings of Jesus, because these sayings of Jesus keep popping up in these different places. It couldn't be that Jesus was there and actually said it, and that's the oral tradition, and that's the tradition of his sayings. Can't be that. Has to be that they borrowed it from someplace. So they make up this document called Q that they have zero evidence even exists. And they've written thousands of pages of books about how your gospels refer to this source that doesn't exist. Just like humans came from the missing link of evolution that doesn't exist. Same fucking argument, They're doing it all over again. It's like, scholars, can you put down the fucking LSD? Okay. Stop smoking pot and make theories based on evidence rather than come up with an idea with no evidence and pretend the evidence is there and then write 75,000 books on it. Like, why would I do that? Why would I write 75,000 pages of books about a source with evidence that we have zero for? Welcome to Bigfoot land, right? This is why I say there is more evidence documented for Bigfoot than Q. There's more documented evidence of Bigfoot than fucking this written Hebrew language. It doesn't exist. We don't have it. It's not there. It's not there. It's not there. So they're making up these theories based on evidence we don't have. They're just smoking pot at the beach with PhD papers, and everyone goes, wow, they must be right, because they came from Duke. They came from Cornell. They came from freaking wherever the fuck Bart Ehrman comes from. That's all they're doing. So your JEDP theory explains style of writing. Shakespeare versus Emily Bront. Shakespeare versus Mark Twain. That's all they're doing. And they're explaining these stylistic and theological differences because they're like, oh shit, these don't match. What do we do? And that's the same thing that Q is doing, this magical Q source that doesn't exist. Oh shit, Matthew and Luke, what do we do? They match, they don't match, we don't know. So they have to explain this. And they have to explain it within the framework of Jewish religion, modern, and Christian modern religion. They can't go out of those bounds. If it's not fitting in Babylon, it cannot fit in our theory. Does that make sense? The biggest problem with JEDP is there was no language like this at the time at all. So if I say Yahweh, sitting at a coffee shop with my friend today, and someone 2,000 years ago said Yahweh, they're putting our writing literally in the same category. Well, this lady on YouTube said Yahweh, and 700 years ago, someone else said Yahweh, so we're going to put them together in a group and date it to 950 BC. That's literally what they're doing with this theory. So take a screenshot of that, and these are the major breakdowns. It's very logical arguments to refute this. But I like the theory because I like using it to explain to Christians that no, Moses didn't walk out of the river out of the fucking Red Sea, okay, holding scrolls with all of these laws written down. Like Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible. That didn't happen. And they don't understand these different sources and different groups and different people. So on a faction level, I think it's effective. But when it comes into the actual scientific dating evidence and way they put this theory together, it doesn't hold water. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, we're finding in our study series that they meaning Levitical priesthood, ancient Levitical priesthood, the people coming back from Babylon and Persia, erased and ritually cursed a tribe of Ephraim and the whole last northern kingdom. They invented a language called modern Hebrew, Masoretic text, and assigned that modern language all the way back to Phoenician graffiti found 2,900 years ago. So they literally made up a language. And so the language we made up today is actually the same language as 3,000 years ago. Same thing. We remember. That's how we did it. Could you imagine that? I'm Polish. Could you imagine? If I said, well, modern Polish, forget that. I made my own Polish language, and I'm dating it back. Me and this group of Polish people made up a language. And our language is the same language that they used in Poland 3,000 years ago. You would fucking laugh me out of the bar, dude. Seriously. You would laugh me out of the bar. But because I'm not a rabbi, political borders change. Scholars change. Theories change. You know what doesn't change? The corrupt fucking priesthood. They never fucking change. And they're all still serving ancient Egypt. That's what it is. So the ancient Egyptian rabbis, the ancient Egyptian rabbinical Jews of today, we can't go against them. So we're just going to validate their made up bullshit language. But if it's me and I did it, well, who's that? That's what they're doing to people. They invented a modern language and assigned it to Phoenician graffiti 2,900 years ago and said, yeah, David was talking about Yahweh. You got to say the name right. That's what they're doing. They linked themselves, Levite priesthood, linked themselves to Judah, Edomites, Herodians, linked themselves to the tribe of, called themselves the tribe of Judah. That's what they did. And then said, and David was the tribe of Judah too. That's what these people did. Then they went through the Bible. We showed this, I think, in our Meet Ephraim series. They went through the Bible and they made everything Jerusalem, even if Jerusalem literally wasn't established yet, because the Bible doesn't go in chronological order. So like I gave an example last time, Micah is like one of the last prophets. No, Micah's one of the first prophets. You should read him first because if you're going in sequence. They put the Bible all out of sequence so nobody knows who the fuck's coming and going. So you're reading a story and it says, oh, and he went to Jerusalem. Well, he couldn't go to fucking Jerusalem. Jerusalem wasn't a place yet. Like it doesn't even fit on the timeline, but no, it's Jerusalem. So they went through, they made everything Jerusalem. Later on, especially with King James, they erased all the names of gods and made everything Lord. So you don't know what fucking gods they're talking about. We talked about this in Ruth in the Meet David series. We just took one little paragraph of Ruth and showed how many different ways there is to read that. These guys came back from Persia and they wrote chronicles to jankify the genealogy. Look into that. Sarah Jaffet does a great job. There's a couple scholars that I refer to in my book to show how they did this. Go to the scholars at Tel Aviv University, dude. They're all over this janky Chronicles shit out there because they're not faithful to the priesthood. They wrote a bunch of laws coming back from Persia and said, everybody, you better follow our laws because Moses said so. And they did that to control the people on behalf of Persia, not on behalf of Moses, not on behalf of God. Keep the people in control or Persia's going to come in and fuck your shit up. So, I'm sorry that that's true. I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense. Like if Persia's going to come in and decimate the whole fucking place, if you don't get your shit in control, you're going to get your shit in control. Well, how are you going to do that? You're going to lie to the people and say, Moses said so, God said so. You can't have guys with crushed testicles in the synagogues. Like that's not a law. Come on. A guy with crushed, you got to check his testicles before he comes into church. Like, if you think that's a Levitical law came from Moses' mouth, I don't know. I don't know to tell you. Then you can believe that. It wasn't. It was a ritualized system of laws that they were doing within a certain culture to take control of the people and make these rules and regulations. And nobody was going to follow it unless fucking Moses said so. That's what it is. It's the when I lived in Saudi, same thing with the Sharia law police. You have to have your abaya this long or else. Why? Because God said so. That's their fucking answer. You think God said that I have to wear my abaya a certain amount of inches from the ground? God didn't say that. You know who said that? The religious police. The Islamic religious police said that. God didn't say that. Same thing with this fucking janky ass priesthood of quote unquote post-Babylonian Jews. They wrote it in to control the people. So we got all this. So my question then is, why the hell wouldn't they could be, I don't know, modern scholars. They could be anywhere in the history of Rome. They could be modern rabbis with the Masoretic text, or they could be ancient Babylonian Levite priesthood claiming to be Judah, or a combination of all of them. But whoever they are, how do we trust that they wouldn't also, after doing all that shit, why wouldn't they shove Yahweh in everyone's mouth? Most notably, David's. It's weird to me that David says Yahweh, 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 Yahweh. Every fucking 2 words coming out of David's mouth, always Yahweh. But Jesus never said it. Jesus is the son of David. Why wouldn't he be calling the same name of the same God that David did? There's a problem there. That's a huge fucking problem. And like, just think about that. That's a huge fucking problem. So David called the name of the rabbinical Jewish God, but Jesus didn't? But Jesus is related to, how is this working? It doesn't make sense with logic. It makes sense with word salad of academia and priesthood. But it doesn't make sense with logic and history. So I'm going to go back and say, when looking at language acquisition from a reading specialist lens, there's a clear order. Hearing, saying, reading, writing. You can't read a word you've never heard. You can't write a word you've never said or never heard. You've never heard the word everybody get out a piece of paper and write down a word that you've never heard and you've never said. You can't do it. Write a language based on words right now that you've never heard and you've never said. You can't. That's the trick. So all of this Yahweh, quote unquote, Hebrew Bible, it's not in the context of a stable written language that already existed. You have to have that. You can't read or write without a set system of both phonological and phonetic language. The system of graphemes. And I argue, in that year, they didn't. So their quote unquote writing was simply a dialect of ancient Phoenician. That is conceptual and phonology based, not phonics based. And you can't shove our modern ideas of literacy back into 3,000 year ago text. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So both of these JEDP theories and the Q theories, they're both trying to explain away spiritual jurisdictional infrastructure with pot smoking English lit scaffolding. They're both assuming that this magical Hebrew phonics-based written system existed and were edited somehow or pieced together later. And this is when I say the scholars do not take into account the supernatural, quote unquote. They don't understand the grid that I explained to you last time. They're not seeing it through a jurisdictional lens of different groups of people. Remember we went on the floor last time and we have the entities taking jurisdiction, right? And I said when God's presence comes in, those astral kingdoms collapse. Well, God's not literally, right, walking into Egypt, like physically, okay? It's not like some dude with a beard from the Sistine Chapel, like the painting. He doesn't come walking into Egypt, okay? Where his presence is coming is on the grid. So God's presence or registry-backed covenant holders' presence come into that grid space over Egypt that's also interlocked in Egypt. And he's walking into the frog lady's kingdom in the astral, okay, in the spiritual woo-woo. God's presence, either personally, his energy, his spirit personally, or through one of his covenant-backed people in the hierarchy, one of his SWAT team people, come rolling in to the astral kingdom of the frog lady. And it instantly collapses into outer darkness. What does that look like when the domino effect hits Earth? That looks like the plague of Egypt. It's ritual. As above, so below. But people are so earth focused that they're literally thinking that, like, you know, God's finger came down from the Sistine Chapel and like touched the water. Like it's a different way of thinking about this jurisdictional override. Moses was the registry-backed carrier enforcing jurisdictional override of God. And it looks like punishment. Because if you're the dude that's running the astral kingdom and that shit collapses on your head, it looks like you're being punished, right? But for me, who's getting yanked out by the presence of SWAT Team David, it doesn't look like a problem to me. It looks like, thank goodness I'm out of there. So one person's collapse is another person's rescue. And it's summed up in the Bible as punishment or wrath. But wrath according to who? Does that make sense? We've got to really look at this language and understand it in this ritual, supernatural infrastructure and the culture and beliefs of the gods that they were dealing with at the time. Okay? I mean, the scholars don't even understand occult ritual. They throw all that out. And they're like, well, these people said Yahweh and those people said Yahweh, so let's put it together. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. So they're trying to explain away this jurisdictional infrastructure by grouping them based on, words on a page with a language that doesn't exist. So they're assuming this magical Hebrew phonic system existed and were edited, but nobody accounts for God's dimensional presence. They're not accounting for the oral transmission of these stories. And if what sounds were coming out of David's mouth were properly coded into text, or are we looking at like David's coat of arms? Like what were the sounds coming out of David's mouth? And how do you know that the people are like, oh, that was Yahweh. David said Yahweh. We're sure. No, we're not sure because David didn't fucking write it down. He didn't have a language. He had a picture card with the picture of his son on it. That's what he had. That makes sense? So they're not using this override covenant logic. They're not looking at spiritual warfare. They're looking at Bigfoot scrolls. So the thing that I hate the most is the words, quote unquote, ancient Hebrew Bible. Because when scholars say ancient Hebrew Bible, the audience thinks language. No. When you hear the words ancient Hebrew Bible, think people. Covenant people. It's their Bible. It's a people group, not a language. And those people groups spoke different languages. David and Jesus did not speak the same language. David and Jeremiah didn't speak the same language. They certainly didn't have the same writing system. It was still evolving. They were different dialects. So you can't just say there was this monolithic ancient Hebrew phonetic system and it matches what the Masoretic rabbis wrote today. No, that's just kissing ass to the priesthood, whether Rome or rabbis. They're just kissing ass to the structure of the priesthood that never changes. And why did it ever change? Because they all go back to Egypt. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. So that's why I don't like the JEDT and why I don't go by it. The only reason I like it is because it gets Christians to think, wait a minute, we have different political motives here. We have different groups of people and different political motives. And if you just stop there and come out of the Moses wrote it, right? And you just understand we've got different factions, and some of us might have been Yahwist people, and some of us might have been Elohist people, and some of us were like Deuteronomy law people, and some of us were ritual, priestly law people, temple people. You got all these different things, these different groups. Now take those groups and disperse them across time. There were Yahwists in Egypt. There were Yahwists in David's time. There were Yahwists in 500 BC. There were Yahwists today. The Yahwist group goes across all time because there was no language to link them to. The Elohists go across all time. Does that make sense? Maybe it came from the ancient Phoenicians. Maybe it came from the sea people. Maybe it developed organically with the bio people from Syria. Like, we don't know. But we do know that they went across time. These beliefs were not just the ancient Hebrew language versus the ancient Hebrew people is a big one. And I think if you can put last video and this video together and think of it in the lens of where's the fucking text, dude? They don't have them. So until, I'm going to repeat this one, until your scholars come out with your Bigfoot scrolls that don't exist, we can't have a JEDP theory the way they say. Because David didn't have a language to write it down to begin with. So we have to start asking different questions and not trusting the pot smoking PhDers who are making things up without evidence.
We own that door. You try to stop us, and we will knock it down.
The fuck around and find out.
It's time for the shepherds of Israel, of Shiloh, Ephraim, to rise up.